I'm Ryan Urbanowitz, and welcome to Part 3A of Machine Learning Essentials for Biomedical Data Science. In the two videos encompassing Part 3 of this video series, we'll cover the preparation of data for downstream machine learning analysis. In the present video, we'll cover the initial aspects of data preparation, with focus on exploratory analysis and some of the key elements of data wrangling. Here's a quick reminder of the parts making up this video series. In the last video, we covered biomedical data, goals, and challenges. Due to the amount of content we're going to cover, I've split Part 3 of this series into two separate videos, with 3A focusing on exploratory analysis and data wrangling as mentioned, and 3B focusing on data splitting and feature processing. As a refresher, here's a schematic illustrating the potential elements of a data science pipeline that utilizes machine learning. Over the next two videos, we'll discuss all of the elements leading up to and including data preparation. But again, for now, we're just going to cover these initial elements. As we saw on our last slide, a data analysis pipeline should typically begin with the clear definition of a target problem. Here's a quote by Charles Kettering hinting at the importance of this. Specifically, a problem well stated is a problem half solved. Effectively, we want to be able to clearly define and communicate the problem, associated goal and/or hypothesis, the nature of the data itself, as well as the target outcome of interest, and the size and the quality of the data. This is also a good time to think about any available domain knowledge we might have access to, including potential sources of bias, what reasonable assumptions we're willing or able to make, whether there are already known predictors of our outcome, including possible covariates, and whether we know ahead of time that some features in our data will need to be extracted or engineered prior to any kind of statistical or machine learning modeling. We'll learn more about all of these domain knowledge elements later on. These are all important considerations when preparing to conduct machine learning analysis on your own or when preparing to speak to a data scientist to get their advice or engage them as collaborators in the research. The next step in our analysis pipeline is data collection. Here are some questions we may need to consider at this point. What kind of problem are we trying to solve? Do we have the right data to try and solve our target problem? What data sources might already exist that we could access to solve our problem? Are there patient or other privacy concerns that will need to be addressed in order to access, analyze, or share data? There may be important ethical considerations here. Is the data public, or does it require special permission, training, certifications, or approvals to access? Once we obtain the data, where will it be stored? Do we have the space? Do we have proper security and restricted access for data that may be sensitive? In other words, data with patient identifiers. Also, is the data structured, semi-structured, or unstructured? And based on its format, what processing might need to be done before we can start to analyze it? And also, will we need to generate new data from scratch if sufficient data doesn't already exist? And what will our study design look like for the collection of that new data? At this point, we hit our first machine learning pitfall, specifically bad data. Ultimately, bad data can lead to bad everything downstream. So what specific problems am I referring to when I say bad data? First off, data can be noisy, including uninformative features or conflicting or misleading information with respect to our target problem. Data can also be dirty, and by this I mean that it can include missing values or errors in values that don't reflect the true values at the time of collection. Furthermore, data can be sparse, meaning that the sample size might be sparse, there could be a large number of missing values, or you could have categorical features with a large number of possible categories. For example, a feature like zip code, with many possible unique values across the country. Data can also be biased, which may be the result of selection bias in how the data was collected, or it could be due to outliers or survivorship bias. In other words, only patients that were still alive were available to have their data collected. And lastly, duplicate data, where instances may have been repeated by accident in the dataset, or features may exist in the dataset that are perfectly or highly correlated with one another. So what are potential solutions for the pitfall of bad data? First, make sure that you've taken steps to clearly define and understand the target problem. Second, employ exploratory analysis. These first two elements will help provide the proper perspective to identify and address bad data. Third, seek to apply best practices when either collecting or cleaning data. We'll discuss this more on upcoming slides. One common question that comes up during data collection is how many instances are needed for machine learning? Unfortunately, the answer here is it depends. There's no simple rule. It's ultimately going to depend on the complexity of the problem, the complexity of the learning algorithm or algorithms that you're using, the ratio of the data that will be used for training versus those that are held out for model evaluation, and whether data is being further set aside for replication or validation downstream. However, here's a very rough guide to how much training data you need for machine learning based on my own experience. Generally, I'd recommend a minimum of 100 samples per class to train simpler machine learning models. To train more complex machine learning models, such as deep learning, I'd suggest a minimum of 1,000 samples per class. Having 5,000 samples per class would put you more in a comfort zone for machine learning modeling on average problems. And having 10,000 samples per class would put you on pretty solid ground for most any situation. Again, these are just rough guidelines. Simpler, cleaner problems require fewer instances for effective training, and more complex and noisy problems will likely require more. However, keep in mind that when it comes to sample size, sometimes more isn't always better. Sometimes more is just more. After all, the addition of poor quality or inconsistent data is unlikely to improve machine learning performance. Now let's take a slightly closer look at this question of sample size. Here are some possibly better ways for you to answer this question for yourself. For one, you can look for published research in similar problems to see what sample sizes were effective in those previous studies. You could also employ a statistical heuristic to estimate a target instance count. This could be some factor of the number of classes, as I gave in the last slide. In other words, have X independent instances per class. Or it could be based on a factor of the number of features. For example, having X% more independent instances than there are features. Or it could be based on a factor of the number of model parameters, as in the case of applying logistic or linear regression. For example, use X independent instances per model parameter. In general, be aware that nonlinear algorithms will likely require more instances to be as effective. Also, the detection of complex, multivariate interactions will require more instances as well. Furthermore, you could use simulated datasets to empirically evaluate the relationship between dataset size and model performance in order to get a better estimate of the number of instances you'll need. Ultimately, we make the best with what we have, and most people would recommend that you gather as much data as you can afford to collect based on the constraints of either time or money. Now we move on to data preparation itself. On the right here, we can see the portion of our data pipeline schematic focused on data preparation. We'll spend the rest of this and the next video discussing all the elements included here. But first, from a high-level perspective, let's review the purpose of data preparation as a whole. First, it's about getting us oriented with our available data. Second, it's about getting data into a format that machine learning can work with. Third, it seeks to identify and remove errors and potential biases. And four, it seeks to provide machine learning with the smallest set of relevant or maximally informative features as possible. As our first data preparation element, let's discuss exploratory data analysis, otherwise known as descriptive analysis, or EDA. The purpose of EDA is to analyze and investigate data using summaries of main data characteristics or visualizations. It's typically conducted to preliminarily understand or discover patterns between features and outcome, or among features themselves. It's also applied to spot anomalies, outliers, and errors, as well as to check assumptions for downstream statistical tests and to test initial hypotheses. There isn't really a single best time to conduct an exploratory analysis, as aspects of an EDA might be useful to conduct as an initial assessment of data quality, and others might be useful to conduct just before moving on to modeling. It's best to think of EDA as being continuously integrated into the entire data preparation phase of a machine learning analysis pipeline. So what are some example aspects of conducting an EDA? It can involve generating feature summary statistics, including mean, median, mode, range variance, interquartile range, etc. Or it can be used to assess feature and outcome types or counts. In other words, determining if variables are categorical, numeric, etc. EDA can also include examining correlations between features. For example, generating this heat map visualization of feature correlations. EDA can also focus on explicitly examining univariate associations between individual features and outcome, and you can do this by applying relevant statistical tests of association or generating plots such as bar or scatter plots. EDA also includes evaluating possible class imbalance in classification problems, as well as counting the missingness of data values across features and/or instances. And lastly, EDA is the time to apply strategies for detecting data outliers that may need to be addressed. This brings us to our second machine learning pitfall, class imbalance in modeling. So the problem here is that when we have class imbalance, we're training and evaluating a model with a much larger proportion of one class than the other. This can influence the performance of certain modeling algorithms and how we interpret our model evaluation results. Potential solutions to having class imbalance include 1. Keeping this class imbalance in the data, but making sure to be mindful of its presence and making sure to focus on appropriate evaluation metrics downstream. This is the strategy that I personally prefer. Second, you can utilize undersampling. Here we randomly sample the majority class to make a more balanced dataset. However, the obvious downside here is the loss in overall sample size, which is almost never preferable. Or as a third option, you could utilize oversampling. Here we randomly resample the minority class to artificially increase its sample size to something similar to the majority class. However, unless you can clearly justify this, I'd strongly recommend avoiding this approach, as you're likely adding bias to your data, since in essence you are, to a degree, manufacturing data to create a balanced dataset. Moving on, let's take a high-level look at data wrangling as part of data preparation. This is the process of cleaning and unifying messy and complex datasets for easy access and analysis. It's also referred to as data munging. Of note, data wrangling is often intimately connected to exploratory analysis. In this video, we're going to focus on the aspects of data wrangling necessary for data analysis, including feature extraction, data formatting, data cleaning, and data integration. However, data wrangling can also be simply focused on the preparation of data as a resource for others to analyze. This can include aspects such as structuring, enriching, validating, and publishing data that we're not going to specifically cover here. So let's start by taking a closer look at feature extraction. This is where we create new features when we can't use the original raw data for analysis. So in the simplest case, the data is in a non-tabular form. An important consideration here is that these new features should accurately represent the raw data. Feature extraction can be achieved manually, or it can be automated using machine learning. For example, a researcher could manually craft features from input data, such as the image of a car, to pass downstream for machine learning analysis. This could be features like the number of wheels, the color of the car, etc. Or alternatively, some machine learning strategies, such as deep learning, could be applied to automatically extract features or even conduct modeling directly using non-tabular data. Some examples of raw data for which feature extraction might be needed include images, audio, video, unstructured text, and time series data. Now let's look at a simple example of feature extraction. Here we have some unstructured text from emails, and we want to employ machine learning to detect whether the email is spam or not. We could manually construct features that indicate whether certain keywords are present in a given email. For example, the word money or pills. Or we could characterize other aspects of the email as features, such as whether the email includes bad spelling, or if the email comes from a known sender. These engineered features now constitute a standard tabular dataset that we can pass to machine learning to train a model. A few more bits of information regarding feature extraction. First, there are a variety of feature extraction techniques out there, and they tend to be problem or data type dependent. Second, the term feature extraction is sometimes confused with the term feature learning, which we'll discuss further when we get to feature processing in the next video. And lastly, let's take a look at some other examples of feature extraction techniques. One for dealing with unstructured text in natural language processing is the bag of words technique. Similar to the email example, this counts the occurrence of words found in text samples. But notably, this approach disregards grammar or word order, which might be critical information for making accurate predictions downstream, depending on the problem. Another approach is an autoencoder, which uses a neural network to learn a compressed representation of raw data such as images. Furthermore, there are a variety of other unsupervised learning approaches that are often adopted as feature extraction techniques. Now let's move on to data formatting. We'll define this simply as organizing information according to preset specifications. This is an important logistical component of data preparation so that the data can be utilized by specific algorithms or packages downstream. It involves considerations such as the file type or extension. For example, having tab-delimited text files, in other words, .txt, or comma-separated files, in other words, .csv files. And it can involve the orientation of features and instances in the data structure. For example, if you have a tabular dataset with features as rows and instances as columns, this might need to be transposed so that features are columns and instances are rows. Formatting can also involve whether a header is included in the data file, and what header labels are expected or allowed, for example, features, outcome, and maybe instance IDs, and whether columns have to be arranged in a certain order or position in the dataset. For example, outcome might need to be placed in the first column and all features coming after it. Formatting could also involve items that overlap with feature extraction, such as numerical encoding, where we have to convert features like start and stop dates, which a machine learner might not know what to do with, into a single time duration feature. Or it can involve encoding text values in data into numerical values if the downstream algorithm or package requires it. For example, most scikit-learn packages require all data values to be numerically encoded. However, keep in mind here that numerically encoding categorical values will result in them being treated as quantitative values by most machine learning algorithm implementations, so use some caution here. And lastly, formatting might need to consider using a standard identifier for any missing data values. In general, I recommend avoiding numerical identifiers like -9 or -999, as this can easily lead to mistakes downstream when these identifiers are mistaken for valid numerical quantities. Now let's move on to data cleaning. We'll define data cleaning as the process of removing corrupted, inaccurate, biased, or useless records from the data. First, let's cover some really basic forms of data cleaning. For example, removing redundant features or instances. Redundant features may be duplicate feature columns that were mistakenly included more than once in the data, or they could be perfectly correlated features. With perfectly correlated features, all but one of them could be removed prior to analysis to reduce the overall feature count without losing information. It's best to document these correlations so that if, after modeling, the retained feature ends up being important, we know what other correlated features might be candidates for causality. Redundant instances might similarly have been instance duplicates that were mistakenly included in the data. However, it's certainly possible to have two instances that have exactly the same feature values and outcome, but are truly independent samples. Another form of basic data cleaning is the removal of features that are either irrelevant, in other words, we already know they have no value in predicting outcome, or removing features that might introduce data leakage. Data leakage brings up another potential machine learning pitfall. In the context of machine learning, data leakage occurs when information that shouldn't be in the training set is used to train a model. This could be a feature whose value would not be available when a trained model would have been applied to make predictions, despite the feature having been available in the training data. Or it might have been a mistake as simple as the outcome having been labeled as a feature. So for example, consider a feature that captures the total time until a patient in an emergency room was admitted to an intensive care unit. And in this situation, we're trying to predict whether a patient would be admitted to the ICU. Such a variable would not be available in practice when we're trying to predict whether a patient will be admitted to the ICU, despite it having been collected in the dataset being analyzed. Potential solutions here include getting to know the data and understanding what the features are or represent, in particular in the context of our target outcome. And of course, make sure to remove features that represent data leakage prior to analysis. And lastly, watch out for and track down causes of model performances that seem too good to be true. Often, the first question I ask when I train a perfect or high-performing model is, did I make a mistake? After all, being skeptical of your own work is a great way to avoid mistakes. Another form of data cleaning to consider is the handling of outliers, or data points that differ significantly from other observations. Outliers can represent real, but more extreme edge cases in the data, or they might indicate errors in the data collection, in particular when the feature values of the outlier are impossible. Let's look at outliers a bit further. Here we can see a rough illustration of an outlier in red among a set of data points. As a more formal definition, an outlier is an observation that lies an abnormal distance from other values in a random sample. We pretty much always want to apply cleaning when we encounter impossible outliers, since these often reflect errors in data collection. For this, apply logic and your understanding of the data to identify impossible outliers. So for example, let's say you encounter an instance with a value of 180 for the age of a human patient. Or you encounter an instance with an age of 18 in a study of Alzheimer's patients. In both cases, you would likely reasonably conclude that these were data collection errors, and these values should be changed to missing, or possibly the entire sample removed from the analysis. When it comes to identifying extreme outliers, there are a variety of strategies that can be utilized as part of an exploratory analysis. Examples include sorting, data visualization, statistical tests such as the z-score, and the use of the interquartile range. Once candidate outliers are identified, what you do with them often depends on your specific data and goals. For example, you can choose to keep your outlier or outliers, since these may be extreme but real values. Also, of course, you could remove the outlier, in particular if you suspect it may be an error. But beware of applying your own biases when doing this. It's also safer to remove an outlier when you have plenty of other instances available. Or perhaps it's possible to go back to verify or fix the suspected outlier value if it's possible to recollect that particular bit of information. And lastly, when faced with outliers that lead to data not following a normal distribution, outliers can be de-emphasized using a logarithmic transformation in an attempt to yield a more normal distribution. The last aspect of data cleaning we'll discuss involves missing values. First, assuming we are preparing to conduct supervised learning, where we need outcome labels for all instances, if we encounter a missing value in the outcome of some instance, we'll have to remove the entire instance, since it adds nothing to the analysis. However, if we come across missing values in our features, we have some options. If we plan to work only with methods downstream that can handle the presence of missing values in data, our first option is to leave them alone. Machine learning methods that can handle missing values usually attempts to treat them as neutral information, or they apply some form of on-the-fly imputation, guessing at its likely value. If you leave missing values in your data, I'd suggest that you make yourself aware of how these missing values would be handled in the methods you apply downstream. When it comes to cleaning missing values, your first option is to remove either any feature or any instance that includes missing values. Here, the drawback of removing a feature is that you may be removing a feature that could end up having been important downstream. And the drawback to removing instances is the obvious reduction in sample size, which leads to reduced power to detect true associations. Even if you do not choose this more extreme approach to missing value data cleaning, if you find a feature or instance in your dataset with a particularly high frequency of missingness, it may still be prudent to remove this low-quality aspect of your dataset. Or, as we'll see later, you can ask if missingness itself is predictive of outcome, and we can do this by engineering a feature for missingness. And lastly, we have the option of imputation. Imputation is the process of substituting missing data with placeholder values. My own personal perspective is that imputation should be avoided if possible. At its best, imputation represents an educated guess. But at its worst, imputation can represent manufactured data that adds bias to your analysis. Often missing value imputation is a necessary evil. Perhaps you want to apply a methodology that can't handle missing values, but at the same time removing features or instances entirely is not a satisfactory solution. Imputation can certainly be justifiable, but it should be used with caution and skepticism. There are many strategies available for imputing missing data values, ranging in complexity and performance from dataset to dataset. At a high level, these methods can be separated into either single imputation methods, where the placeholder value is estimated based on other instance values of that respective feature in the dataset, or into multiple imputation methods, where the placeholder value is estimated based on many or all feature values in the data. That brings us to the last element of data wrangling that we'll discuss, and that's data integration. This is the combination of either features and/or instances from different sources or studies. As a biomedical example, perhaps data has been collected separately on patients, including environmental data, such as lifestyle, socioeconomic, or behavioral information, clinical data, coming from electronic health records or perhaps clinical trials, biological data, such as testing for biomarkers or biological processes, and perhaps genetic or other omics data in the form of genome-wide association data, whole exome sequencing, whole genome sequencing, gene expression, epigenetic data, and more. All of this data might originate as different files, perhaps with different formats, and further it could be stored in different locations or even across different institutions. So the first challenge of data integration is overcoming data silos, wherein data may be stored in self-contained islands of isolated access. We may need to get permission to access certain data, establish data sharing agreements, and work out the logistics of access in order to gather all data required for the downstream analysis. Next, we might have to deal with unifying data stored using different formats. Further, it may be necessary to conduct data harmonization. For example, to combine data instances that were gathered across different institutions or separate clinical trials. This unification makes sure that the final dataset has all the same features, feature names, standardized values, value encodings, units of measurements, and so on. And lastly, we might need to think of data security issues, both during the integration process and in storing the final dataset. For example, we may need patient identifiers for the integration process, which will require a higher level of security for the protection of patients. So far in this section on preparing data, we've covered all of the initial elements of data preparation as reviewed in this schematic. Part 3b of this video series will extend our overview of data preparation to data splitting and 5 elements of feature processing. And later videos in the series will cover the remaining elements of a data science pipeline with machine learning. Thank you for joining me for Part 3 of Machine Learning Essentials for Biomedical Data Science. In the next video, we'll extend our discussion of data preparation to include data splitting and feature processing. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to follow my future content.